You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm taking a bit of a chance with today's offering, because despite my best efforts, I found it impossible to track the author of the piece down. It's a terrific haunted house story by Jonathan Cruz, called The House That Remembered, first published in the 27th Pan Book of Horror Stories in 1986. Johnny Maines, editor of a Pan book published in 2010, tells me that Cruz was a pen name and that the man has, in all likelihood, passed. If anyone knows anything about Jonathan Cruz, whose real name might just be Mike, I'd love to hear from you. And thanks to Max Rudd, who some of you might remember as Andy in Hammer and Nails, for bringing this one to my attention. See the video description for a link to Max's channel, movie reviews, book reviews, and much more. Highly recommended. We hope you enjoy this forgotten gem, folks. The House That Remembered by Jonathan Cruz. 1. To the south of Kilkenny, the countryside is intimate, as only the countryside of Ireland can be. Little fields surrounded by walls of stone climb the hillsides and nestle beside the roads. The thatch on the whitewashed cottages is green with moss. The land, though penny poor, has a gentleness about it. It was June, and the roadside verges were heavy with campion and cow parsley. The young man at the wheel of the rented Hertz car felt as though he was driving along a farm track. The girl beside him sniffed the warm country air and smiled, thinking how little had changed here for centuries past. The tarmac on the wandering road and the bright metalwork of the car were intrusions on the timelessness of the place. "It's beautiful, Toby," she murmured. "God, it's so peaceful. We could live here and grow things and raise children. It would be like heaven." Her companion laughed. "You're an incurable romantic, Fran. Think of it in winter when it rains for days on end. You would die of boredom. No, my love, if we can fix the old place up or build something on the site, we'll keep it as a weekend retreat. Dublin's the only place to live and work, if you have to live and work in Ireland." "Oh, darling," she pouted. "You're so damn practical. Can I dream my dreams?" They turned a corner, and as happened so often in Ireland, the landscape suddenly changed. A hill, bleak and uncluttered with stone walls, rose on their right. Before them was a valley, marshy and ill-kept, with a boggy stream meandering through it. To the left, the land climbed, ridge upon ridge, to the purple slopes of the Black Stairs Mountains. Upon the hill, silhouetted against the westering sun, a ruined house, roofless, with windows like empty eye sockets, brooded over this tranquil scene. Toby stopped the car and got out, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "That must be it," he declared, in a voice gruff with emotion. "Isn't it superb?" He opened the car door for his wife of 7 days and took her hand in his own. Following his gaze, Frances shuddered, without knowing why. As they stood there, they became aware of a curious creaking and wheezing, which, as it came nearer, was accompanied by the frying sound of flat tires on small stones. Around the corner, pedaling so slowly that he wobbled in a quite alarming fashion, came a bewhiskered old man on a bicycle. Seeing them, he dismounted, nearly overbalancing as he did so. "I suspect we're going to get an earful of the local blarney," said Toby, out of the corner of his mouth. "Shh, he might be one of your tenants," chuckled Frances, and then, with a wide smile, she bade the old man good day. Off his bicycle he was very small. His face, beneath a shapeless hat many sizes too large for him, was gnome-like, his mouth a toothless gash between a nose and a chin which almost met at their tips. However, he was affable enough. "Isn't it altogether a beautiful evening for enjoying the peace of the countryside?" he declared. He searched his pockets as he spoke, and produced a cigarette packet. When he discovered it was empty, he raised his eyebrows in astonishment and threw it into the hedge. Toby took the hint and offered a packet of Chesterfields. "American," said the ancient. "And isn't that a wonderful country? If I wasn't a man that loved his own homeland more than life itself, that's where I'd be today." "We were just going to walk up to the old house," said Toby, not anxious to become involved in the old fellow's romantic notions. "Aye, well, don't linger after sundown if you go up yonder." His watery blue eyes stared balefully from under his straggly eyebrows. "It sounds as though the place has a history," chuckled Toby. "To be sure it has. Didn't the Fellmartins live in that very house for centuries? For centuries, bad cess on 'em, until one night our brave lads from the village went up there and put a match to it. I burnt it, and sent the godless tyrants helter-skelter to Dublin, begging for the military to be sent to save what was left of their domain." "That would be in the famine years?" inquired the young American. "Indeed it was. The years of the potato famine. The hard times. Fellmartin living up there like a lord, and the villagers suffering agonies of hunger. But they killed Fellmartin's son, you know. And I, for one, don't blame them. A wicked family, an evil house. No one goes up there nowadays. No one even knows who owns it." "I do," said the young man. The girl on his arm giggled nervously. "Why, then, you know more than one who has lived here these 70 years. Who is it, then?" "Me. My name is Tobias Fellmartin." The old man made gobbling noises, and into his eyes came the look of a rabbit confronted by a stoat. "May the holy saints preserve us all," he stuttered. "Who am I to open my big mouth and criticize a family I never met at all, passing on old gossip like it was fresh from the front page of the Cork Examiner?" As the words came tumbling out, the old fellow was anxiously increasing the distance between him and the smiling couple, as though he feared physical assault at any moment. "Hey," laughed Toby, "don't let it bug you. My great-granddaddy was probably a bit of a bastard, and had it coming to him." "Ah, well, sir," babbled the ancient one, "they was hard times indeed." He swallowed and glanced at the gaunt walls on the hillside above. "Have you, begging your pardon, by any chance come to repossess the estate?" "Something like that. I've seen the lawyers in Dublin, and I have the deeds to the house in my car. What we should like is some accommodation in the village whilst we look around." "Then it's Pat Mulcahy's you'll be wanting," said the old man, glad to change the subject. "There's no better place in the whole village. In fact, to tell the truth, there's no other place. We don't have a lot of tourists in Ballymeelin." "Is it a hotel?" asked the girl. "Well, now, not exactly. More of an inn, you might say, for the anglers and such like. Still and all, Pat's a grand, warm-hearted fellow, even when he's sober." "Thank you for your advice," said Toby. "I'm sure we shall be meeting again." The old man took the hint, swung a creaky leg over the saddle of his bicycle, and wobbled away. Tobias and his young bride were left alone in the soft glow of an Irish summer's evening. "Come on," cried Toby, grinning. "Let's take a look at the family heritage." A few yards from where they had parked the car stood two forlorn pillars of stone, upon which had once hung the gates of the Fellmartin house. The rusty hinge pins were still there, and on one pillar a weather-beaten griffin yet stood guard, his blank eyes fixed upon the distant hills. What had been a carriage drive was now a grassy track, curving around the shoulder of the hill on which the ruin stood. The hillside, close cropped by sheep, was green with that luminosity you only see in Ireland. The broken walls of the house were painted with brown and yellow lichens, and softened by clumps of purple toadflax and delicate spleenwort ferns rooted in the old mortar. "It's beautiful," exclaimed Frances. "The colors are so rich. You could build such a wonderful place here, and you've all those lovely old stones to begin with." Her husband laughed. "Perhaps we'll build a house here, but it'll be a modern one with big windows and a studio facing north, so I can bring some work down and have long weekends." "Well," said Francis rather disconsolately, "I'm sure you're the best architect in all Ireland, not to mention New York, so I know you won't desecrate the place." They had ascended the curving path as they chatted, and now they passed between the columns of the portico, massive and grey, and stained with green slime where the rains of 100 winters had trickled down the roofless walls. Francis shivered as they entered the ruin, for the temperature seemed to fall several degrees, and an unpleasant odour of decay rose to their nostrils. The floor was a mound of masonry and broken tiles, thickly coated with moss. A rook, startled by their intrusion, rose on clattering wings, and its raucous cry echoed between the crumbling walls. "My God," muttered Francis nervously, "isn't this just a creepy place?" It was a statement, not a question. By way of reply, Toby did a strange thing. "Fellmartin!" he shouted, and louder still, "Tobias Fellmartin!" As the reverberations of his wild cry died away, they felt a sudden chill, and the silence pressed in upon them. Then the wall of the chimney breast above them trembled and groaned, and began to sag, the stonework opening into jagged cracks as it broke away. "Look out!" screamed Francis, and seizing her husband's arm, she dragged him back towards the entrance. The dust of old mortar followed them in a rolling cloud out onto the friendly hillside. "That place isn't safe," said Tobias shakily. "Fancy the sound of my voice bringing all that rubbish down. Quite uncanny." "Something in the house doesn't like you," said Francis, clutching his arm. "Didn't you feel it the moment we went in? There's something evil in there, something just like you said. Uncanny." Toby snorted. "Oh, come on, Fran. Everybody knows that sound waves can start avalanches. It was just stupid of me, that's all. You've been influenced by that whiskery old idiot we met on the road." "But why did you shout your name so defiantly?" asked Francis. He didn't answer, and they walked back to the car in silence. 2. P. E. Mulcahy, licensed to sell beer, spirits, and tobacco, was the legend above the door of Ballymeilin's most prominent building. In one window, a yellowing card advertised accommodation. They registered, the proprietor almost climbing over Toby's shoulder to have a first glance at his signature. "We met a little old man on a bicycle who recommended you to us," explained Toby, smiling. "Sure, and that would be Hughie McGinnity, the old rascal," replied Mulcahy. "A grand wee fella, except that he lives in the past a bit too much, particularly where paying for his drinks is concerned." Francis and Toby were shown up to a pleasant room on the first floor, where they cleaned off the dust of their journey and passed away an hour in the manner of newlyweds the world over. Mulcahy's Select Lounge was a tiny room leading off from the bare, Guinness-smelling public bar of his hostelry. Into this little parlour, with its fireplace and carpeted floor, Toby and Fran were ushered when they came downstairs for a drink, before their evening meal. "Ah, now then, you and your lady wouldn't want to be drinking in a grim old place like my public," cried Mulcahy, taking each by an arm. "Isn't this the cosiest little snug you ever set your eyes on, and television too, if you want it?" "Well, thanks," said Toby. "But to be honest, I'd sooner stand and drink in the bar with the locals. Perhaps hear a bit about what the place was like in the old days." Despite Mr. Mulcahy's protestations, Toby insisted, and they joined the half-dozen or so early regulars who already had their stout on the bar counter. The landlord drew a pint of draught for Toby and poured a bottle of McCardle's light ale for Fran. She felt a degree of hostility in the room, but said nothing to her husband. A tall, gaunt man with high cheekbones put his glass on the bar noisily and broke the silence. "Ladies don't usually stand up to the bar hereabouts," he drawled, in a voice that was none too friendly. "Nor Fellmartins, neither." "That's no way to be talking to a visitor, Peter. Indeed it's not," snapped Mulcahy, shocked. "Sure, old man, them days was long ago," said another customer, a middle-aged farmer with stubble on his chin, and a flat cap pulled down hard over his eyes. Toby smiled evenly at the gaunt one. "You say Fellmartins don't come here and stand up to the bar. When did you last see a man of my name in Ballymeelin? I thought my family left this place 100 years ago." "Aye, so they did. Them that could. But there's a few of your kinsmen about. They call themselves by other names, but the Fellmartin blood is in them." "And you still hate them?" "My name is O'Mallon," said the man dryly, and picked up his hat and walked out of the bar. "I think we'll take our drinks through to the snug," said Toby, embarrassed by the turn of events. Mulcahy smiled unhappily. "Don't think everybody here is like O'Mallon," he whispered. "I'll see the girl has your supper ready in a few minutes." After breakfast the following morning, Toby sought out Mr. Mulcahy, who was cleaning up the bar. "Tell me, Mr. Mulcahy, who are these kinsmen of mine that Mr. O'Mallon spoke of last night, and where might I find them?" "I don't know, and that's the truth," he declared, leaning on the handle of his broom. "Oh, of course I've heard some gossip, but you hear all sorts of strange tales in an out-of-the-way place like this. Now, as for passing on bar talk to a stranger such as yourself, well, I don't believe I should, for there's no knowing what trouble I might be stirring up." "No trouble, Mr. Mulcahy," said Tobias mildly. "I assure you I have undisputed possession of the Fellmartin property. The Dublin lawyers have been very thorough. It is just that I want to give no cause for rancor in the community if I choose to come and live here." "Live here?" exclaimed the landlord, and his eyebrows shot up. "You mean rebuild the old house?" No, pull it down and build a new one." "Then take care. I'm not a local man, you understand, but I've heard some nasty things have happened up there since the house was burnt." "Such as?" People meeting with accidents when they've tried to take away a few stones, and a young laddie falling down the well shaft, things like that. The villagers say it's an evil place." "Who in particular says it's an evil place?" "I can see you're a persistent man, Mr. Fellmartin. Then go out of here and up the road a little way towards the house. Where it turns to the right, you'll see a lane, a track, no more. At the end of that track is Kate Cormac's cottage. Take a half-bottle of gin with you." Toby parked the car at the entrance to the lane, which was overgrown with brambles. He and Francis picked their way carefully along the muddy path to the front door. The cottage was a tiny, one-story building. The thatched roof had moulded to a dull grey colour and sprouted thin blades of grass in places. The door hung slightly askew on its hinges. They knocked and waited. Footsteps shuffled slowly towards them, and at last the door creaked open. They were confronted by an extraordinary creature, grotesquely fat, and clothed in a sack-like garment that reached to the floor. Over her straggly silver hair she wore a black shawl, which she clutched together at her throat with fingers like small sausage rolls. Her face was expressionless, except for two glittering black eyes set deep into the puckered flesh. "Can we come in and talk to you?" asked Toby, giving her a friendly smile. She quizzed them suspiciously, her eyes flickering from one to the other. The folds in the lower part of her cottage loaf face parted to reveal a scattering of broken yellow teeth, like the tusks of some aged animal. "What would you be wanting to talk about?" she croaked, making no effort to open the door wider. "About old times. Do you know who I am?" "Turn your head, sure. Your face is in the shadow, and my eyes are not as keen as they used to be. Mother o' God, you're a Fellmartin, are you not? I am. Tobias Fellmartin, a direct descendant of the man by that name who once owned the big house. Tobias Fellmartin. Aye, the nose and the eyes are right. So you've come back to haunt us, eh? She chuckled, and just for a fleeting moment, Fran heard a young woman laugh. The past will have to give up its secrets now there's a Fellmartin back in the village. She peered more closely into Toby's eyes, thoughtfully. It's not revenge you're after, is it? The time is past for that. If it is, I'll not speak with you, for the evil that was done long ago, and some things are best forgotten. Revenge? Toby laughed aloud. Revenge because the peasants got mad at my ancestor and burned his house? No, I don't want revenge, just what is rightfully mine. He lifted the bottle of gin from his pocket, and the old crone twisted her face into what might have been an ingratiating smile. You'd best come inside. The fire will blow out of me great if I keep this door open much longer. The living room of the cottage was small and dark, heavily scented by the smoke of a peat fire. A blackened kettle hissed gently on the hob, and the old woman produced a large brown teapot and 3 chipped mugs from a cupboard beside the fireplace. Fran and Toby perched themselves on a battered oak settle whilst the tea was made. Old Kate sank into her moth-eaten armchair, and, having slurped a noisy mouthful, peered conspiratorially over the rim of her cup. I have the power, you know. Do you believe that? Sometimes I see the little people, not to speak to, but I see them all right, and I've heard the banshee. Suddenly, her small bright eyes took on a fearful look, as if the recollection brought back a sudden terror. Aye, the banshee. There's few that can say that, and fewer that will talk about it. She poured a generous measure of gin into her tea, and sipped it thoughtfully. But what do you want of me? You've not come just to pass the time of day with a foolish old woman. Toby smiled. Mr. Mulcahy didn't seem to want to talk too much about the Fellmartin family and the history of the old house. He said you knew more than most. I was hoping you might be able to tell us a bit about the old days. I could, said the old woman slowly. But will I? That's the question. Some things are best left buried and forgotten. Oh, come on, Kate, cried Frances enthusiastically. Toby and I will soon sort out those old grudges. I mean, nothing you tell us about the old days will change our way with people. We want to be friends and good neighbors. A puff of smoke blew out of the fireplace, and a flurry of raindrops pattered against the window pane. Kate took another swig of the gin-laced tea and drew her shawl more tightly round her shoulders. There's some things you'd best hear from me, I suppose, but if you've come after the gold, forget it. Tobias folded his arms and said nothing, but the disclosure was too much for Fran. Gold? She squeaked. Do you mean there's some hidden treasure? How exciting! Some say there is, said Kate. You see, the house was burned in the famine years. When the people was gathering, old Joshua Fellmartin, 'tis said, hid the family plate and ran away with his wife and youngest son to Dublin. Oh, to be sure, he made a pretense of having business to attend to, but he had a good idea what might happen, because he was a hard man and well hated. The older boy, Tobias, stayed behind. He had a tryst with a girl from the village. Besides, he thought the people wouldn't harm him, for it wasn't he who had oppressed them. Kate laughed grimly. How wrong he was, poor soul. They came and they burnt the house, and his bones were found in the blackened ruins. Their leader was a woman. Some say she tortured Tobias to make him tell where the treasure was hid. When old Joshua heard what had befallen his house and his son, he had a stroke and died, so the gold was never found. So it might still be there amongst the ruins? Gasped Fran. So it might, but it's a brave fellow, and some would say a foolhardy one, that goes looking for it, as time has proved. You see, the woman who provoked the rising died there too, and they say she haunts the ruins yet. Do you believe that? The old woman hooded her face with her shawl. Yes, she replied. I believe there are souls unable to rest on that hilltop. I've heard them, and sometimes I think I've seen them, but dimly, thank God. But, she added, pointing a pudgy finger at Tobias, your husband is a Fellmartin, and whatever is there belongs to him. You may be given a sign, young man, but if you are, take care, for the manner of it may not be to your liking. Kate would not be drawn any further, and began to protest she had said too much already, so Fran and Toby took their leave of her. I've a feeling, said Fran, as the cottage door closed behind them, that Kate Cormac could tell us much more than she did. Toby smiled. Well, she's certainly whetted my appetite. I think I'll have a poke around up there this afternoon. Francis took his hand. Darling, I know it sounds silly, but I think the old woman is right about the ruin. I could feel the evil in that house yesterday. And you believe the ghost of that lady who tortured my ancestor tried to push the chimney on us? Maybe. You acted strangely yourself, you know. Tobias snorted angrily. Well, I'm still going. We're talking like a couple of superstitious peasants. If ghosts exist, they certainly don't walk in broad daylight. Look, Toby, why not just call in a firm of contractors and have the whole place leveled? If there really is a treasure, presumably it'll be turned up. In any case, the site will be clear if you want to build on it. If I want to build? Yesterday you thought it was the most beautiful place in the world. We were going to put our dream house there, remember? Now it's if we want to build, and me that's doing the building. Another point you seem to have overlooked. If one of the contractor's men turns up something valuable, it'll be off the site and away to Dublin or London or even New York, and we'll be none the wiser. Francis pouted. You're being unreasonable, Toby. Go and search if you must, but take care. While you are poking about, as you put it, I'll borrow the car and drive down to Waterford. I'll spend the check Daddy gave us on some glassware for the flat. All right, said Toby gruffly. I'll go back to Mulcahy's and get a snack lunch. Then I'll buy a shovel and a crowbar in the village. What time will you be back? About 6, I should think. We'll meet in the pub then. 6 o'clock. They were both a little edgy still, and parted without a kiss for the first time in their brief married life. 3. Despite its magnificent situation on the broad tidal reaches of the River Suir, Waterford is a rather shabby town. Yet it has some quaint and picturesque side streets, and it was in one of these that Frances found the second-hand bookshop. She had purchased her glass and some other things besides, and was just exploring in a casual sort of way. She wandered through the open doorway, and began perusing the bindings of the volumes on display in a vast oak bookcase, itself a museum piece. Many of them were concerned with theology, some with Irish politics, and some were just solid Victorian novels. A title caught her eye, and she pulled it down to skim through it. It was called Legends and Tales from the Province of Leinster, and had been published at the turn of the century by a Church of Ireland clergyman, Robert Fitzstephen. As she held it in her hands, it fell open at the title page of the last chapter. Her heart jumped as her eyes took in the heading. Fellmartin, the sorry tale of a family doomed to disaster. I'll take this, she gabbled to the assistant, a pale girl with dark hair and glasses, who had materialized at her elbow. How much is it? A lovely book, isn't it? Said the girl. Just come in from a sale. The price should be inside the cover. Yes, here it is. £5. £5? Squeaked Frances, rummaging in her handbag. The girl mistook her excitement for consternation at the price. It's beautifully bound. Quite old, too. A real collector's book. Oh, thank you, madam. Shall I wrap it? No, thanks. replied Frances. "I'll take it as it is." And so, after she had ordered tea in a little cafe looking out on the river, Frances began to read the Reverend Fitzstephen's account of the disasters which overwhelmed the Felmartin family so many years ago. The Felmartins, according to Fitzstephen, had come to Ireland with Oliver Cromwell, who crushed with an iron fist any Catholic resistance to the rule of the Puritan Parliament in Westminster. He had given land, or rather redistributed the land of those bold enough to oppose him, to men he trusted to keep the Catholic peasantry in order. Jacob Felmartin, a rugged East Anglian of yeoman stock, was the kind of man he chose. However, they were not just the lackeys of the Lord Protector, these Anglo-Irish. When the Stuarts returned to the throne, they were strong enough to hold what they had been given, and when William of Orange defeated King James at the Boyne, they became undisputed masters in their new realm. The villagers of Ballymeelin were glad to take Felmartin's coin for quarrying and hauling the stones for the great house that Jacob began, and his heirs completed. The halcyon times of the Felmartin family were the years of the Napoleonic Wars, and the first quarter of the 19th century. The estate prospered, and with it the village, for the breeding of horses for the armies of Europe proved vastly profitable. But then, perhaps because the Felmartins chose their spouses less carefully than their horses' mates, the vigour of the family stock declined. Daughters outnumbered sons. The physical characteristics of the Felmartins, big bones, broad shoulders, solid frames, deteriorated towards paunchiness and a tendency to diseases of the heart and kidneys. The local populace, who had come almost to respect the family in their palmy days when a Felmartin could hunt and shoot and crack a bottle with any other in Ireland, now began to resent the foppish manners and soft lives of the owners of the big house, as it was known. Joshua, when he inherited the domain in 1833, spent more time in Dublin and London than he did on the estate, so absenteeism was added to his sins. Only his elder son, Tobias, seemed to have the old Felmartin spirit, and rode with the Kilkenny hounds and tipped a gallant cap to the Colleens. In 1845, the potato crop failed, and potatoes had become the staple food of the Irish peasantry. In 1846 it failed again, and famine stalked the land. The old and the weak starved. Bolder and more vigorous spirits took themselves off to America to build a new life in a new world. Amongst those who could not or would not leave, resentment against the landed gentry smouldered until, in some districts, it broke out into active rebellion. One such district was the parish of Ballymeelin. Having read so far, Frances was interrupted by the proprietor of the cafe, asking if she would like anything else. She realized with embarrassment that her tea was stone cold, and she had not drunk a drop. "Sure, that must be a terrible interest in old book," chuckled the owner as he brought her a fresh pot. "Shall I be pouring this one for you myself now?" She nodded and smiled, and went back to her reading. One evening, in the autumn of 1847, wrote the reverend gentleman, there was a meeting of the Young Ireland movement in Ballymeelin, and rebellion was openly preached. Afterwards, when the speakers had taken the road to Kilkenny, a woman's voice rallied the sullen but leaderless villagers to action. Clambering onto a wagon in the village street, which the Young Ireland revolutionaries had just vacated, Bridget O'Mallon, a woman known, as a magistrate subsequently put it, for her strident tongue and disregard of any authority, drew the crowd around her. "Our children starve," she screamed, "whilst Felmartin feeds fresh meat to his dogs. My own darling husband lies in Cork prison, awaiting transportation, because he stole a bag of corn from Felmartin's stables. We live in poverty because of the rent he charges for land that is rightfully ours. Yes, and ask my cousin Patrick Haggerty what happens if you cannot pay. Ask him what has befallen his poor wife since she was evicted by Felmartin's bailiffs, God rest her soul." The crowd muttered angrily, for Mrs. Haggerty had just died of consumption in a cold outhouse belonging to a neighbour. "In that wicked house," she continued, "there is gold and silver enough to see us all through to the next harvest. It is our gold, taken from us by Cromwell's lackeys for 2 whole centuries. Let us take back what is ours and destroy what is theirs." A young man with tousled black hair and eyes that burned with righteous indignation leapt up beside her. "Bridget O'Malley is right," he roared. "Go to your homes and prepare what weapons you have. At midnight the moon will be up, and we'll march against the tyrant, and burn his house, and put the fear of God into him, so that he never dares show his face in Ballymeelin again." "Death to Felmartin!" cried a drunken voice in the crowd. "Let's see the devil gets his due." A roar of approval went up from 100 throats. Then Bridget O'Malley spread her bony arms and waited for silence. "You've made up your minds," she told them in a voice which, though it was little more than a whisper, was heard by every man and woman in that throng. "I see all your faces. Don't any one of you fail to be back here at midnight, for the man or woman who betrays Sean Clancy has me for an enemy to the grave and beyond." As she spoke, a young woman on the edge of the gathering slipped silently away. She went to her grandmother's cottage, for that night it was her turn to look after the old lady. After she had made her a supper of thin broth, she sat before the fire, wondering what she should do. Her name was Siobhan McKenna, and she was carrying Tobias Felmartin's child. Eventually, as the moon, dusky red and huge, crept above the distant hills, she left the cottage silently and made her way up the slope towards the big house. What exactly happened after that, the narration continued, we may never know. Sean Clancy and the villagers went up to the house right enough, and the house was burned. Yet there were dark deeds done besides, or so it would seem. Clancy, at his trial, swore that the house was afire even as he reached the door, that Bridget O'Malley was there before him with a stranger, but that the man ran away, and she was killed by the McKenna girl who ran out of the flames and plunged a dagger into her heart. He said he knew nothing of Tobias Felmartin's death. The remains of that unfortunate young man were found in the smouldering embers, but he was hanged for arson and murder nonetheless. 7 other villagers, identified by an informer, tried to verify his story, but were given short shrift by the judge and sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. The rest of the villagers lay low, for who would admit to complicity in the crimes of arson and murder? And their guilty secrets died with them. "Died with them," mused Francis, putting down the book at last. "Officially, perhaps, but not in the folk memory of the people, I'll be bound. I'd wager every detail of that horrible night has been told and retold down the generations in the village of Ballymeelin." She paid her bill and left the cafe. Now that she had knowledge of the facts concerning that grim occasion more than a century ago, she felt she could perhaps persuade Kate Cormac to talk more freely. She also had a growing disquiet, a fear for her husband's safety. The afternoon was drawing to its close, and the frightful malevolence of those dark grey stones on the hilltop haunted her imagination. She pointed the Hertz car in the direction of Ballymeelin, and drove at a speed that sent hens clucking into the roadside hedges, and caused farmers' wives to call on all the saints to witness this madness, and the driver a slip of a girl, no more. 4. After he and Francis had parted that morning, Toby walked down to the ironmonger's shop in the village. An old-fashioned bell tinkled as he opened the door. It was gloomy inside, and there was scarcely room to walk between high racks of shelving containing kitchen utensils, cans of paint, and boxes of nails to reach the counter at the back of the store. A young and not unattractive girl greeted him with a friendly "Good morning." "Hello," said Toby. "I want to buy a spade and a good strong crowbar. Oh, and I better take a pair of those rubber boots, size 9, I think." "You're Mr. Fellmartin, aren't you?" said the girl, a wary look in her eyes. "I am," admitted Tobias. "And you?" "Mayor O'Malley. I think you met my uncle yesterday." "I did. I'm afraid he wasn't too friendly." She laughed shyly. "He lives in the past. Some people around here are like that. Even my father, though he's not as bad as Uncle Peter." "And you?" inquired Toby. "They bore me with their old stories. I'm glad you've come. I hope you knock that crummy ruin and build a nice house there. It gives me the creeps." "I'll knock it down all right. Now, how much do I owe you for this little lot?" "Wait now. I make it £24.50. Is that right?" She turned the slip of paper on which she had done the additions in pencil towards him and almost rested her head on his shoulder. "Just about," he said, opening his wallet with a smile. "Here you are then, £25. She rang up the sale on an old-fashioned cash register, took out a 50-pence coin and placed it in the palm of his hand. Then she looked at him with troubled eyes. "I expect I could find someone to help you, if you were thinking of going up to the old house today. Not that it's any business of mine, but perhaps the work may be heavy for a gentleman like yourself, I'm thinking." "Thank you," said Tobias gravely. "But I won't strain myself. I'll just poke about a bit to begin with." "Take care, then," said the girl. "And don't stay too long." "You were going to say after dark, weren't you?" She tossed her head. "I expect you think we're just a bunch of superstitious peasants, Mr. Fellmartin, and maybe some of us are, but there is something wrong up there, something evil." She broke off, embarrassed because her voice had risen half an octave, and she was staring very directly at the young and quite good-looking stranger. "Okay, miss," said Toby, grinning. "I'll bear in mind what you say, and thank you for your help." He picked up his purchases and left the shop. The walk up the hillside to the old house, carrying the goods he had bought, left him uncomfortably hot and somewhat out of breath. A moist wind was pushing great grey elephants of cloud across the sky, and although it was only mid-afternoon, the shadow of the approaching night seemed to hang over the land. Something caught his eye as he approached the thicket of hawthorn and elder bushes that grew in what had once been the kitchen garden of the house. It was a human form, draped in a cloak and shawl. After a moment's hesitation, he strode purposefully towards the sombre apparition. As he came closer, he realized that the figure was that of Kate Cormack, and when he was a few yards from her, she parted her shawl and spoke. "Go back, Tobias Fellmartin. Death waits for you here." Toby leant on his newly purchased shovel and stared at her bleakly. The sight of that lonely, shrouded figure had frightened him a little before he recognized who it was, and now he was angry. "Widow Cormack, I've already seen how easily these walls crumble, so I'll take care. Now, I'll be about my business, and you be about yours. I'm not speaking of tumbling stones or bruised shins or even cracked heads. There is death in this place. Even now I hear the voices." "Voices?" Toby snapped. "What voices?" Oddly enough, his ears did seem to catch at that moment a distant echo of babbling and weeping, though he dismissed it instantly as the wind in the chimney stacks or the birds in the ivy. "Voices from distant times," muttered the old woman darkly. "The voices of people long dead, but unable to rest. Ah, Fellmartin, you could hear them yourself if you'd open your mind." "You're on my property, old woman," said Toby icily. "Your peculiar superstitions do not interest me. Now, kindly clear off, and don't interfere with things that don't concern you." "Concern me?" she shrilled, showing her broken teeth in a kind of snarl. "All that happens in this place concerns me. My great-grandmother saw things here that sent her mad and made her commit murder. The spirits that haunt these ruins have cursed my family ever since. Don't you understand, Felmartin? I'm trying to help you." "You can best help me by wasting no more of my time." The animation left her face. Once more her eyes became little black pebbles, and only the flecks of spittle on her colourless lips told of her excitement. Her voice was harsh when she spoke again, and she paused to give each word its due weight. "There is one more thing I will tell you before I go, and then my duty is done, and whatever torments you suffer will be no fault of mine. Last night from my bed I heard the wailing of the banshees up here. Oh, it is a sound to turn your blood to ice and send your fingers scrabbling for the crucifix. It is the sound of damned souls seeking vengeance, the most terrible sound in all the world. It is the harbinger of death." She turned and hobbled slowly away down the hill, supporting herself with a crooked stick. Tobias shouldered his spade and entered the ruin. A thin wind whispered through the empty window frames. No birds perched on the crumbling walls. If he had not been so peremptory with the old crone, he would have returned to the village. As it was, he decided to shift some of the loose rubble and see what he could find. To take his mind off the morbid conversation he had had with Kate Cormac, he worked energetically, and in an hour or so he had uncovered a flight of steps which evidently led down into a cellar. They were covered with green slime, and he descended cautiously, moving debris as he went, his eyes gradually becoming accustomed to the gloom. The walls were pitted with deep cavities, in which, no doubt, wine racks once stood. A low stone table, the top of which was fashioned from a single large slab of limestone, occupied the center of the floor. With his spade, he scraped away the dust and rubbish which lay on it, intending to sit down for a moment. Curious dark stains disfigured the top and ran down the sides. Tobias shuddered, becoming aware, now that he had ceased his exertions, of a dank chill that seemed to issue from the very stones of the place, and a tomb-like smell, an odor of decay, of evil, and of death. 5. Francis pulled up sharply outside Kate Cormac's cottage and hurried along the overgrown path. She smiled a worried little smile when the old lady answered the door. "Can I come in for a minute? I'd like to talk to you." "About that fool husband of yours, I suppose," grumbled Kate. "Well, I've warned him. No one can say I haven't warned him." "About the house, you mean?" "Ah, yes, about the house, about the evil that was done there. Aye, and the evil that yet remains." "That's what I wanted to ask you about. You see, I've learned much more about the burning since we last met, about the rebellion, and Sean Clancy being hanged, and young Felmartin's body being found in the rubble. His name was Tobias, wasn't it?" Sadness clouded the old woman's eyes. "Yes, Tobias was his name. And the girl who killed Bridget O'Malley, her name was Siobhan. A beautiful name and a beautiful girl, so they said, before that awful night." "Was she related to you?" asked Francis on a sudden inspiration. "She was," said old Kate softly. "She was my great-grandmother." "Tell me what really happened," begged Francis, "after Bridget O'Malley stirred up the rising." "Ah, she was a wild, wicked woman, that Bridget O'Malley. She hated the English, for her husband lay in an English prison. She hated the Felmartins for putting him there. She was near destitute, for how could a jailbird's woman survive with no land and a child to feed? She had a plan to steal Felmartin's gold, if she could find it, and an ally in a tinker named McPhee. They crept up to the big house before the mob and took young Tobias by surprise. They captured him and bound him to a stone table in the cellar. Whilst McPhee kept watch, Bridget went to work. Do you want me to go on?" "Yes," whispered Francis. "It's a terrible story, but go on. Imagine that scene." The old woman's eyes reflected the flickering flames from the hearth. The mob marching up the road with flaring torches, singing the old Fenian songs to keep their spirits strong. They're almost up to the great oak doors, when from within comes a terrible cry, so terrible it chills the blood in their veins. It is the last cry of a man dying in agony. Some turn and run in terror. Some steal fearfully away, wanting no more of that night's business. Only a handful stand before the doors when they are thrown open, and Bridget O'Malley confronts them, a long bodkin in her hand, crimson with blood. "What are you waiting for?" she cries. "Burn the house of the accursed tyrants. Are you Irishmen, or are you cockroaches waiting for Felmartin to come back and grind you under the heel of his boot? Burn it, burn it, burn it." Some say there were already flames behind her, but the men who remain surge into the house and cast their fiery torches into the rooms on either side of the hall. The fine curtains and tapestries are pillars of fire in an instant. The grand furniture crackles and smokes as the heat gets to it. No one sees the slight figure of a girl run deep into the house, heedless of the flames that leap around her. Kate Cormac's voice sank to a fierce whisper. Her wrinkles seemed to have multiplied, but her eyes were hard behind their barriers of flesh. "Then," she hissed, "when the flames are roaring from the windows and the mob stand wondering in silence at what they have done, a ghastly figure appears in the doorway, its clothes afire, its hair burned away, its face blistering in the heat. It holds in its hand a dagger. It lurches towards Bridget, who stands as if rooted to the ground. The blade glints briefly in the light of the fire, and Bridget sinks to the earth, the blade buried in her breast. That apparition was the girl who had entered the house unobserved, Siobhan McKenna. She never had the features of a young woman again. Her hand, the one that held the dagger, was forever a shriveled claw, and her mind was destroyed entirely by the horror of that night. Oh, she gave birth to Felmartin's child, all right, in the poorhouse at Clonmel. But the child, a girl, had to be taken away from her and brought back to her relatives in the village." "What had she seen?" stammered Francis, half knowing the answer before it came. "Having told you so much, I might as well tell you all," said the old woman, a weariness in her voice. "But take that crucifix from your neck and hold it in your hand and swear you will tell no one what I'm about to tell you." Francis did as the old woman bade her. Siobhan had a few lucid moments as the years went by. A nun who looked after her in the poorhouse pieced together the story. She crept up to the Felmartin mansion that night to warn Tobias that the mob was coming, but he sent her away. He told her he would reason with them and persuade them to leave peacefully. Perhaps he believed he could. Alas, neither knew of Bridget O'Malley's evil intentions. Siobhan returned, lagging a little way behind the rioters. Then she heard her lover's last agonized cry and rushed forward just as the doors were flung open. She found him in the cellar. His body had been pierced many times by a thin steel blade. Even in death his lips were drawn back from his teeth in agony, and the greatest horror of all, the eyes, which she had gazed into with adoration just an hour before, were pools of congealed blood. From his breast protruded the hilt of a dagger. With all her strength she drew it from her lover's corpse. Tears glistened on the old woman's cheeks as she continued the narrative. Imagine the pain that seared that poor girl's heart. Only one thing mattered to her now: vengeance. The columns of fire that were consuming that once proud house parted to let her through. She felt not the burning, heard not the roar of the flames, or the crackle of the charring timbers. She ran through that inferno, carrying the dagger that yet dripped her lover's blood. And the rest, you know.
How awful, croaked Francis. I think I can understand now why the house does not rest, why the people are so afraid of it. Do you know if Tobias revealed the hiding place of the family treasures?
Kate Cormac shrugged. If the O'Malley woman knew, she didn't tell the tinker, for he ran away, and I've heard tell he died in Tipperary, a poor man all his life. Francis looked out of the window. It was getting dark.
Kate, have you seen my husband today?
Aye, dearie. He was up at the ruins with a pick and a shovel, but I warned him to be away before dark. The house is unquiet just now. Francis took her leave hurriedly and drove down to the hotel. Her worst fears were realized. Mr. Mulcahy hadn't seen Toby all day. She asked if she could borrow a torch. Mulcahy looked uncomfortable. "If you think your husband's up at the house, I'll bring one and come up with you," he declared. "I don't like the place, but I wouldn't see a woman go up there at dusk alone." Francis and Mulcahy left the car and climbed the grassy slope under the loom of the ruined walls. An orange glow along the western horizon was all that remained of the day, and the fitful wind flattened the grass along the hillside and sighed mournfully through the broken stones. Suddenly, Fran's heart missed a beat as another sound intruded above the soughing of the wind, a sound so chilling that she almost ran in terror. It began as a series of yelps and sobs, and then merged into a ululating scream as of a soul in torment. Slowly it ebbed, and became a hopeless groan of pain unendurable, and then rose to a crescendo again, and again. Mulcahy was on his haunches, his hands clasped tightly over his ears to obliterate those unearthly sounds. Fran's knees shook with terror as she forced herself to reject the instinct to run. Suppose those cries were from a human throat. Suppose... She picked up the torch from where it had fallen from Mulcahy's trembling fingers and stumbled into the ruins. The cries echoed from the shadowed walls, louder and more frightening than ever. Francis could not have told you what she expected to see as she stood above the shaft Toby had excavated to clear the cellar steps. What she did see, as she directed the beam of the torch downwards, made her eyes widen in disbelief and her scalp prickle as if charged with electricity. Toby lay on the stone table he had cleared of rubble, his body rigid, his hands at his sides, his feet together as if tied with rope. His head was arched back, and the muscles of his face and neck were horribly contorted. He writhed convulsively, like a man near to death from a violent poison. His eyes were wide with pain and fear, and from his throat, hoarser now and weaker, came those terrible sounds that had been carried to Fran on the wind. "Toby!" she cried. "Toby, for God's sake, stop! It's me, Fran. I'm here to help you." He did not hear her. His eyes, bright with terror, seemed fixed upon a point a few inches above his face, and suddenly Francis understood. A mist seemed to gather in the cellar, a mist and a darker shape within it. The shape took a human form, and it held a long, thin bodkin close to her husband's face, and a shrill, cruel voice spoke from the mist, a woman's voice. "Come along, me darling," it said. "Sure, hasn't it just been a few little pinpricks so far, but now time is short, and I'll have to start work on them lovely brown eyes of yourn if you won't tell me where your daddy hid his gold." "It is here, beneath this stone I lie on," croaked Toby. "Now, in the name of Jesus, have mercy on me." The answer was a hysterical cackle. "English bastard," hissed the woman's voice. What I would have done for gain, I'll do now for pleasure." The point of the bodkin descended to within an inch of her victim's eyes. With an effort of will, Frances broke the trance this ghastly vision had induced in her. Wrenching the small silver cross from her throat, she flung it down on the wretched figure below. "May the devil take you, Bridget O'Malley!" she cried, and heedless of the drop, plunged down after it, sprawling amongst the rubble and dust, bruising her knees and cutting her hands on the sharp stones. As she picked herself up, she saw her husband shake his head and roll over onto one elbow, like a man waking abruptly from deep slumber. The crucifix slid from his chest to the floor with a tiny chink. She hastily gathered it up. "What's happened?" mumbled Toby. "God, I feel awful. I've had some sort of a terrible dream. Where are we?" "We're in the old house. Come on, Toby, we must get out. It's almost pitch black." Tobias rose stiffly to his feet. I think I know where it is. The family plate, I mean. It came to me in my dream. I was being tortured by some ghastly woman. In the end, I told her, but it made no difference. She was going to kill me anyway." "I know," said Frances gently. "I was there too. Now come on before anything else happens." Mr. Mulcahy, who had arrived belatedly and fearfully on the scene, helped them out of the ruin, and they blundered down the dark hillside to Kate Cormac's cottage. The old woman made them tea and dabbed Fran's grazes with warm water and tincture of iodine, while she listened to the girl's halting account of what had happened. "It may be that the ghosts are laid now," she said, "but here's my advice, and you'd be wise to take it." They did. Next day, a demolition contractor from Cork moved in. Firstly, under the supervision of Toby and Fran, they lifted the great stone slab, and recovered from beneath it a fine gilt and silver dinner service, some other silverware of choice quality, and 4 magnificent gold candlesticks. Then the bulldozer was started up, lorries came to cart away the usable stone, and the rest of the ruin was buried beneath a goodly layer of topsoil, and seeded with meadow grass. But Frances and Tobias never built a dream house in Ballymeelin. Dreams, as they so frighteningly discovered, can unexpectedly become nightmares. The land was sold. Cattle graze on the lumpy turf where the house once stood, but though old Kate says the hill is quiet now, no villager will set foot on it once daylight begins to fade. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,